In continuation to what we have discussed so far, we're going to take up a new theme today, which is entitled as natural resource management. And in this particular module, we will be trying to look at why conservation of natural resources is utmost necessity, and some of the debate on what is common versus property rights and regimes, and by taking the works of a few scholars who have worked on this aspect. And we would also be primarily dealing with some of the case studies which have been done with regards to conservations of forest, and more importantly, by giving utmost importance and emphasis on the community-based resource management with regards to forests as well as water. So today we're going to in some sense give a preliminary overview of what natural resources is, what natural resource management is all about. So partly we have covered this in the introductory lectures, what natural resources are, and we could highlight a few of these more importantly, like air, water, sunlight, soil, minerals, forest, wildlife, and so on. And natural resources, as we all know, are something which is occurring in its natural or unmodified settings. So that can be in some way being extensively utilized in order to meet the needs of humankind for millennia or ages. So the very notions of natural resource management actually dates back to the primordial or the ancient period, and more importantly the indigenous peoples, how do they associate it and then relate with the natural resources, and how they have in some sense sustainably managed the resources. But with the inroads of modernity, and then with the inroads of the science and technology, many of the way in which these resource has been managed has in some way been questioned, and there is a different way of branding this sort of management of resources from the Western civilizational discourses. Now, as we all know, natural resources are the basis of human life, and we actually engage in using these varied natural resources in different ways, in different geographical and cultural group, depending on the kind of necessity which we have in order to meet our basic needs. So natural resources can be broadly divided into two, that is renewable and non-renewable natural resources. So what are these renewable natural resources? They are the resources which can be refreshed or refilled or revitalized in a short span of time, like resources such as air, water, sunlight, forest, etc. Whereas the non-renewable resources are the resources which cannot be actually replenished, or which cannot be replaced in a short period or span of time, like materials, coal, petroleum, natural gas, metals, etc. Because these sort of resources actually take a lot of time, millions of years, in order to be formed. So as human beings, with the growth of populations and with the rapid industrializations, urbanization, so on and so forth, we have in some sense engaged in trying to in producing a lot of waste materials which are actually being dumped and literally thrown into the environment, and this waste in some sense causes a lot of toxic items, pollutions of natural resources like the air, water and soil. So therefore we sort of encounter issues of air pollutions, depletions of water resources, and also desertifications of the soil. Now what then is natural resource management, and why is it important, and what are the way in which how resource has been managed? So natural resource management, or NRM, in fact refers to the sustainable utilizations of major natural resources which I have already pointed out, like land, water, air, minerals, forest, fisheries and wild flora and fauna. So these resources provide the ecosystem services, a better quality to human life. It in some way enhances to the not just the living but also the quality of human life and the non-human species as well. So natural resources provide a fundamental life support in the form of both consumptive and public good services and ecological services maintained, soil productivity, nutrient recycling and the cleansing of air and water and climatic cycles. So this very term natural resource management is often used interchangeably with resource management or environmental management, which perhaps first appeared in the States way back in the 1960s. But one cannot say that these very notions of natural resource management were unknown in earlier societies, that is prior to the way in which how we come to know about this. So it has in some way been known much before and long before, and natural resource management practices have been notably used among many indigenous peoples for ages. So the very notion of this in Western society, that is beginning from the early part of the 17th century, so the introduction of such as wildlife management through recreational and sport hunting and fishing regulation, and we are also by now informed that the emergence of national parks are also being part and parcel of the conservationist movement which has developed in the West and particularly in the States. So we can actually refer to some of the works which I have already partly mentioned earlier in our previous lectures, that two imminent environmental movement have emerged, that is the preservation and conservation. And John Muir, who was also known as the father of national parks, was the founder of the Sharia Club, and he actually was instrumental in or the mastermind in trying to spearhead the preservation movement, that is way back in the late 19th century, and this was an attempt to look into the issues of how or to countercheck the measures such as the human caused devastation of the resources. So therefore in some sense it is one of the pioneer environmental movement per se. Now what is the problem which is being noticed, and then how do we situate the issues which has been encountered? So natural resources were actually being used too rapidly, and then the nature of how depletion takes place was pretty fast and enormous, and on the other hand, the political control in some sense has been instituted to conserve resources for future generations. So, and on account of which we can also actually see that many institutional formal laws such as Conservation Environmental Protection Act or so and so has been initiated in different countries in different historical period of time. Now one can pause and then think over that, are we sustainably using the resources, or are we really using up more than what is actually available or what is actually required. So one can see that the current global population, which is 7.2 billion, and which is much more now, the earth's total resources are only good enough for the existing 2 billion people and at the current demand. So the math in some way reveals that it is obvious that we are on the negative trend. So which means the existing resources cannot really afford to meet the requirement of the population which we have at hand globally. Now secondly, the way in which we are living, that is our lifestyle, that is we are using already 2 to 3 times of the existing earth's natural resources than what is actually sustainable. So therefore there is an emerging imbalances in terms of the growing demands and what is actually available, or which can actually be sustainably used and managed. Now there is also a growing concern and necessity to conserve these resources, because we need to conserve these resources because even when there is no glaring evidence that these resources are actually going to last for a long time to come, even in the future. So by considering man's usual consumptions of these resources, which we have already do a kind of mathematical calculations, that a time will definitely come in the near future that there are some resources which will be gone and being extinct or exhausted. So most importantly, the non-renewable resources which we have pointed out, like oil, coal, petroleum and so forth, are the ones that are actually in high demand, and humans actually have to thrive in order to find an alternative resources for the ones that have been lost. And of course for replacing the oil and petroleum so and so forth, of course people have come up with a more sustainable efficient energy such as sunlight or maybe certain other things, but which is only being used in a very small proportion at this period of time. And that specific task is not so easy, and one, because there may be a possibility of unavailability of or scarcity of it, or maybe the cost is pretty much high. So one can actually look at the way in which the cost effective cases is something which we need to look into, and conserving these natural resources against reduces the rapid depletion of biodiversity, and it also maintains the balance of the undisrupted ecology. So conservations of biodiversity or natural resources is now usually being discussed at different fora, and then it has in some way embraced the conception, the broader conception of conserving the earth itself by protecting its capacity for self-renewal. So the current thinking also in some way favors the protections of the entire ecological regions by the creations of such as the biosphere reserve. Now, the very notion or the term called conservations came into use in the later part of the 19th century, and also it refers to the management mainly for the economic regions of such valuable natural resources such as timber, fish, game, topsoil, pastureland and minerals, and also more importantly the preservations of forest and wildlife, national parks and also the water set areas. So what does conservation actually mean then? Conservation actually means the natural resources has to be in some way used wisely, that is the earth's resources has to be used wisely by humanity. Now one can actually go on to see that why is forest important. We could actually see the importance of forests partly because forests actually help in the help to preserve the biodiversity, and also forests are the natural habitats of plants and animals, and forests also provide timber, wood, fueled medicines, fodder, etc. So in some sense you could actually see that what are the kind of resources which we can actually generate from the forest. Forests also help to maintain an ecological balance, and forests also help to control the climate and rainfall, and the presence of forests also help to prevent soil erosion and control floods. So we could see the rampant erosion of soils and the flash flooding as a result of the cases of deforestation. And one of the glacier melting or the flash flood which was encountered recently in Uttarakhand was one of the glaring examples of how the natural resource has been depleted, and more importantly on account of deforestations. And as we all know, forests also help to maintain the supply of oxygen and carbon dioxide which balance in nature. Now one could perhaps imagine that a world without forest, or maybe the world which is deforested, or maybe devoid of trees and so on and so forth. Now we could see that an estimated 18 million acres of forests are destroyed almost each year, and half of the world's forest has been actually cleared for different purposes, for setting up the pace of constructions of roads, dams, and then mining, and also paving the way for supply of industrial raw materials, and also urbanization. So half of the world's forests have actually being cleared, and deforestation actually contributes to 12 to 17% of the global greenhouse gas emissions annually, and trees absorb greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, so they produce the oxygen we breathe. So forests are actually the habitats of millions of species. Now, as I had pointed out, some of the probable causes of deforestation are urbanizations, illegal logging, agriculture, and subsistence farming, and the consequences, some of the likely impacts are as we all are aware, like such as soil erosion, global warming, and which are actually caused by the rise of the greenhouse gases and extinction of species and loss of biodiversity. And flooding and drought are some of the phenomenon which we often encounter in the past few decades. Now, why then water is again the cases of who are actually the stakeholders of this forest, and one can sort of categorize some of the stakeholders who are the following: people who are actually living closely around forests and depends on forests for their livelihood. So, for example, the extractions of fuel, fodder, and then the non-wood products, or the non-timber forest products. So, and then secondly, they are the industrialists who actually use the forest as the source of extracting raw materials, and more importantly, the work such as manufacturing paper, medicines, furniture, and so on and so forth. And we also have the forest department, which is part of the government, who actually owns the forest, or maybe claiming those forests as protected sites or protected areas, and actually control the resources from the forest. And nature and wildlife organizations want to conserve and preserve forest. Now, these are some of the modes and methods of conserving forest, and which of course is not really necessary and important at this point of time, but for the sake of our discussion, since we are looking at how conservations of resources are. Now, conservation of forest is again some of the main important agenda in almost every country, and it has to be tackled with perfect coordination between forest department and other departments. And it is also, there is also a growing urgency that people's participations in the conservation of forest is of significance, and we could actually see the joint forest management programs which are being initiated by the government. So therefore, one can also see that the uprooting or cutting of trees must be actually controlled and stopped at all cost. And we also have programs like social forestry, the Van Mahotsav, for planting and protecting trees on a large scale. And alongside what we have discussed, that is the forest, wildlife also again plays a very important role, and the importance of wildlife actually helps to preserve the biodiversity, and it also helps to maintain the food chains and food web. So we also get useful products from the wildlife, like food, medicines, bones, honey, and so on and so forth. And what are the way or the steps which are involved in conserving the wildlife? So preserving the natural habitats of animals, and the ban of poaching or maybe huntings of animals, and also to engage in protecting endangered species of animals, and setting up wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and biosphere reserves, etc. So why then the conservations of biodiversity is important? Because since biodiversity provides the base of our livelihood, cultures, and all, as well as economics of millions of people, which include different works or various walks of life, and more importantly the forest dwellers, that is, who are closely associated, and then who depend on the forest or biodiversity directly. So therefore, for them, like it sort of like provides a raw material for diverse purposes, such as the medicinal and healthcare system. It also provides the genetic base for the continuous upgradations of agriculture, fisheries, and also for critical discoveries in scientific, industrial, and other sectors. So therefore, the rapid erosions of biodiversity in the last few years or decades has in some way imposed or impacted on the health of the land, water, and water bodies, and also more importantly the people. And we also have seen cases of extinction of species. So what then is an extinction? Extinction can be a situation in which certain kind of species is continuously being poached and then hunted such that it is no longer available on earth. So which are also considered to be endangered species. So extinction of species can be considered as an important consequences of the depletion of resources. As if resources get depleted, then type of species dependent on that resource or that particular ecological niche would also get depleted along with it. So why is again water resources or water important? We all know that only 2.5% of the world's total volume of which is the available water resources is considered as fresh water, and of that 2.5% and 70% is frozen. And we are also in some way aware that the depletions of our water resources is more serious than the current oil depletion, and there are substitutes for oil, but nothing can really replace our potable or safe drinking water. And 70% of the available fresh water that remains in use in agriculture, and then 20% in industry, and only 10% is actually being used for human consumption. And as we all know that we sort of agree that water is the basic necessity for all living things, and we of course depend on water on a daily basis, and more importantly for agriculture, transportation, constructions of building roads, dams, etc. And therefore water is a natural habitat for the aquatic organism as well. Now one of the main causes which lead to the depletions of water resources are the increased irrigations and then the increased use in agriculture, and also roads and infrastructure prevent water seepage in the soil, and the rising temperatures, and which eventually would actually lead to the shortage of drinking water and food shortage again. Now therefore the human activity which are actually affecting the availability of water, and which of course cause pollutions of water bodies, and one of the main reasons for the loss of underground water availability is a failure to sustain water availability underground has actually resulted largely from the loss of vegetation cover and diversion for high water demanding crops, or maybe the use of pumps to supply extractions of underground water for agriculture purposes in a very large scale, or we could say in commercial farming. And then also the pollutions of which actually is being seen from the industrial effluents and also urban waste are actually harming the water bodies and resources. One of the possible way of conserving water or conservation of water actually is, perhaps it could be a step to secure the future. And the most essential among all the natural resources, as we all know, on earth is water, and a drop of water actually is more than it has no comparison, and it has no price actually to be paid for. So therefore, water conservation is what that can actually reduce the scarcity of water, and it also aims to improve the efficiency of use of water and reduce losses and waste. So some of the tips which we can actually take into considerations to save the water is to use it in a much more sustainable manner. And one of the basic things which we can do in our everyday life or everyday routine is to turn the tap off when not used, especially when we engage in brushing teeth or maybe so and so forth, or maybe while washing clothes. And one should also avoid the leakage of water from the taps. And perhaps we can also broadly engage in the rainwater harvesting, which of course is another method to conserve the water. And then the water supply actually should be limited in those areas which enjoy the unlimited water supplies. One can also engage in practices such as the water harvesting or rainwater harvesting. So water harvesting is nothing but collecting and storing rainwater for future use. So the common methods of water harvesting are, for example, digging pits, ponds, lakes, etc. And then many engineers are actually with the help or with the participation of the locals have there are successful initiatives which are being taken in order to tapping the rainwater or harvesting rainwater. So one can also possibly build an earthen dam, a small earthen dam, or maybe a concrete check dams, and the constructions of dikes, or maybe constructions of reservoirs, and constructions of rooftop collecting units in houses. So one of the advantages of underground water again is that it does not evaporate easily, and it spread out and reaches the wells, and then it does also not polluted pretty easily. So we also have this practice of the water set management. So what are the aims within this? So water set management is again a scientific way of developing primary and secondary sources of water, and the use of scientific method to increase the biomass production as secondary sources, so that no ecological imbalance occurs. And they also work on initiating or rejuvenating ancient and traditional way of water storage, along with the mega projects like dams and reservoirs. Now again, apart from what we have discussed so far, that is forest and water, again the conservation of soil is important. So soil conservation measures in some way attempts to look at the process of minimizing the loss of soils. So in order to do this, proper land utilizations coupled with agricultural practices should be adopted. So some of the methods of conserving the soil is being outlined here. The first one, perhaps the crop rotations. So an alternatively growing, say for example a cereal or maybe a legume in the same field will not only multiply the productions or productivity, but it will also increase the fertility of the soil, and they also engage in checking the soil erosion. The second is the mulching. So culturing operations will also kill weeds, and soil mulches helps the plant that is which is to be rooted firmly in the soil. And the second is the strip cropping. This is again an agriculture practice of growing plants and in suitable strips in the field. So and dry farming method, this may be practice where rainfall supply is low and indefinite and variable. So in the dry farming methods, only crops are grown that can sustain even in cases of low rainfall. Now, as we all know that the human population is increasing continuously, and consumptions of natural resources is also increasing enormously. So with the fast pace or increase of industrializations and urbanizations of the modern human society, the use of all the resources is increasing almost every day. So if these resources are not properly utilized or managed and used, there will be cases of serious scarcity of these resources in the near future. So therefore, this is one of the reasons why we sort of need to engage in conserving the natural resources. And conservation is nothing but a proper management of natural resources in order to prevent its exploitations, destructions, or degradations. So why should we then engage in conserving these resources? As we all know that we can't really live without these resources, and then which perhaps provides all the basic needs which are deemed considered to be utmost necessary to us. But on the other hand, we are engaged in over exploiting or overusing these resources, and if we go on over exploiting the nature, there will be no more resources available to us in the future. So therefore, there is an increasing urgency or urgent need to conserve the nature in order to maintain the ecological balance for supporting life, and also to preserve different types of biodiversity, and also to preserve the natural resources for the present and the future generations. So this has in some way to be in line with what we have looked at in sustainability or sustainable development. So why is the need for this management of natural resources again? So which we have partly already discussed, and the proper management of natural resources consists of the judicious use of natural resources and avoiding wastage of natural resources, that is to consume only which serve only the purpose of what we want to really consume, that is not using or extravagantly. And also a long-term planning, that is for the use of natural resources, so that it lasts not only for the present, also for the future generations. And the exploitations of natural resources should not be for the benefit of only a few people, but should be distributed equally for all. So therefore, the hierarchy or the prioritizing of few people's actually exploiting the resources is something which we have to avoid, and then which of course we have partly discussed in the environmental ethics with regards to social ecology. So while extracting and using natural resources, we should also plan for the safe disposal of waste so that no damage is being caused to the environment. Dumping of toxic items or maybe the industrial effluents to the water bodies is something which we really need to look into. So therefore, the management of resources requires a long-term perspective so that this will last for the generations to come and will not merely be exploited to the health for short-term gain. So this management also should ensure equitable distribution of resources so that all, and not just a handful of the elites or rich and powerful people benefit from the development of these resources. So resources has to be equitably distributed. So why do we really think, and is it necessary to have an equitable distribution of resources? Because the natural resources of the earth again must be distributed among the people uniformly so that each and everyone gets his share of the resources. However, human greed, corruption, and lobby of the rich and the powerful are actually the forces working against an equitable distributions of resources. So one can perhaps do a mathematics of this by calculating that how much resources are actually being consumed and controlled by few sections of the people. So therefore there is a huge imbalance and inequitable distribution of resources. Now one can perhaps in the context of India, one can perhaps looks at what is the urging need and what is the kind of attention which we need to really look into. The way in which resources are being used and the very rate of how resources are being depleted is something which we all need to look into, and it is a very alarming situations. For example, the forest and arable land is being depleted due to urbanizations, overpopulations, and overconsumption, and wildlife resources are also being lost due to illegal poaching, hunting, as well as the industrialization, and as a consequence of which water bodies are being depleted or being contaminated and also drying up due to industrialization. For instance, the productions of Coca-Cola or Coke, which we all feel to be pretty much fascinating, actually used up a lot of fresh water bodies, and the water bodies are actually being contaminated as a result of this. So the conservation of natural resources in India actually has different laws or regulations are being initiated or undertaken, and many measures for the conservation of the resources. So regulations and reforms for proper housing and infrastructure development to avoid land acquisition problems, and also mass media public service messages to educate the people on the importance of such as why we should engage in conserving resources or conservations of resources, and also the increased wildlife and forest reserve in the country, and also different schemes to do a proper inventory of the resources and monitor changes in the environment, and various projects and schemes that promote conservation of resources. So some of the legislations with regards to conservation or biodiversity conservation and wildlife protection act, various laws and acts actually have been passed in Indian constitutions for the protection and conservation of various natural laws, and there are a lot of them, but I've just highlighted a few of them here. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, and Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974, and Forest Conservation Act 1980, which of course have been amended over time and again. And then also we have this Air Prevention and Pollution Act of 1981 and the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So within this we also have the environmental impact assessment, which of course is very much important when any kind of development projects are to be an initiative, and if any sorts of harmed is going to be impacted on the environment. So in the future lectures, future part of the course, we can in depthly look at the environmental impact assessment, and then what are the kinds of initiatives which are being, or process which involve in this. For instance, the environmental impact assessment is being done if, for example, a dam is to be built. So and experts will try to look into the feasibility, or try to make an in-depth study of to what extent the environment is going to be affected. So the 3 R's, which is again important in order to save the environment or conservation. So the 3 R's which are being used is to reduce, reuse, and recycled. So these 3 R's actually tries to denote some of the basic way in which how the environmental concerns and increasing awareness is very much being in our midst, and then people are actually taking initiatives in order to or practice this. So reduce actually means using less natural resources, and also avoiding wastage of natural resources. And recycle actually means the materials like paper, plastic, glass, metals, so on and so forth, which are used for making things, can't again be used for making new things instead of synthesizing or extracting new paper or plastics. So therefore there is this process of reusing or recycling it. So the reuse means things like using things again and again, like the plastic bottles in which we buy certain kinds of edible items like jams, pickles, extra, and then can be used again for storing things in the kitchen, and then not simply dumping them away. So what are the advantages of sustainable natural resource management? So in some way, the advantage of this sustainable natural resource management is to engage in controlling the use of resources in such a way so as to provide for its equitable and continuous availability, not only to the present generations, as we had already outlined, without doing any harmful impact on the environment. And some of the advantages again is the equitable distributions and controlled exploitation, that is minimal harm to be done on the resources, a minimum wastage, and disposal of waste. Now, natural resource management approaches can be in some way categorized according to the kinds and rights of stakeholders. Now, the first one is the private property regime, that is where it is actually being single-handedly owned by an individual, which is a private property more of. So the second is the common property regime, that is the property rights arrangement in which a group or maybe a community of resource user, that is where a boundary is usually being drawn by a group of people, that exclusiveness or exclusive belongingness. So they sort of share the rights and duties towards a resource. So they in some sense become a guardian of that particular geographical area or resources. So we also have this non-property regime like the lake fishery, and the state property regime, most importantly the national forest and national park. Now, before actually going into or dealing with that debates on the common and private property, now one can further look at that why the natural resource management is necessary. Because we as a human being engage in eating, drinking, growing food, making clothes, building houses, and also transport, for example. And however, natural resources are not infinitely available for human use. So not only the non-renewable, but also theoretically the renewable resources are limited. So communities actually should be economically, or be economical with the way in which how natural resources are to be used in a sustainable manner. So in many regions of the world, if you looked at, this general shortage is aggravated by the degradations and again destructions of natural resources, example the soil erosion, and this is mainly due to the overuse or a non-adapted use of these resources. So the resistance and regenerative power of many landscape systems are thereby exceeded, and then for example the water balance problems actually threaten the living conditions and limit the use of resources, for example destructive flooding and droughts, and these problems are actually indicators of non-sustainable management of natural resources, and the underlying causes of these are actually pretty much manifold. So as a consequence of which some possible uses of resources are increasingly restricted. For example, food productions and rural livelihood may be threatened, as well as resource use conflict may occur at times. So finally, we could see that the development chances of the specific regions are increasingly impaired. Now, one can also see that how one engage in trying to look at the community based of natural resource management, and then why is it important. Now, the community based conservation actually involve people who directly affect and are being affected by conservation decisions in the conservation planning and stewardships. So the local people actually need large quantities of firewood, small timbers and thatch, and bamboo is actually being used in order to build huts and baskets, and also for collecting and storing food materials, and implement for agriculture, fishing and hunting are also again largely made of wood, and forests are sites of fishing and hunting. So in addition, people are dependent for gathering edible items such as fruits, nuts and medicines from the forest. So their cattle also in some way graze in forest areas, or feed on other fodder which is collected from the forest. So people living in and around forests are pretty much dependent, because it provides a direct economic and social benefit to resource users, while maintaining or improving biodiversity and the land health. So what is this community-based natural resource management, or why is that the management of natural resource is again important? So the proper management of natural resources again consists of the way in which how we use it pretty much judiciously, and one of the particular aim of community-based natural resource management is to obtain a voluntary participation of communities in a pretty flexible program, and that also incorporates a long-term solutions to problems which are arising from the use of natural resources. So one can actually look into how the natural wildlife resources, that is a system of group ownership and territorial rights for the community resident in the region, are looked into, and the management of these resources should be placed under the custody and control of the residents peoples, and it also provide appropriate institutions under which resource can be legitimately maintained and managed and exploited by the local people for their own direct benefit. So this benefit can actually take the form of economic benefits, more important, that is income, employment, and production of those resources. So community based natural resource management, if we look into the definitions, is a process by which, for example, landholders gain access and use of rights to, or maybe ownership of natural resources collaboratively and transparently plan and participate in the management of resource use and achieve financial and other benefits from their stewardships. So this is the definitions which we get from the works of Child and Lyman. So one can actually see that from our discussion so far, that what are the resources, what are the necessities, and then what are the way in which why we really need to engage in conserving these resources. And the other forms is that how one can situate and look at the community-based natural resource management. So we will further look upon some of the debates on the differences or the binaries which are created between the commons versus the private property, and then how this evolve more importantly from the works of Herdin and Ostrom. And A Tragedy of the Commons, as you all know, is one of the seminal works of Garrett Herdin, and then one can also again see the works of Elinor Ostrom, where it tries to refute or tries to give utmost importance to the commons in terms of managing the resources. Now, community-based conservation normally involve people who are being directly dependent or affected, and also as a consequence of various conservation decisions, at the same time the conservation planning and stewardship. So it also in some way provides direct economic and social benefits to resource user, while improving or maintaining biodiversity and the land health. So we could actually see the way in which how the local community or people who are closely associated with the natural surroundings or resources are actually pretty much not just dependent for the means of livelihood resources, but also in terms of maintaining and in some way conserving and nurturing the resources. Now, what is community-based natural resource management? I'll definitely come with a few examples and case studies in the upcoming lectures specific to the community-based natural resource management. So now let's try to familiarize ourselves with what community-based natural resource management is. It is a process by which the landholders actually get access and use rights to or ownership of natural resources collaboratively and transparently plant and participate in the management of resource used and achieve financial and other benefits from other stewardship. So this is the definitions which we can have access and from child enlightenment. Now further, the community-based natural resource management approach it attempts to combines the management combines both conservations and objectives with the generations of economic benefits for the specifically the rural communities, and in other words, the community-based natural resource management actually refers to the collective use and management of natural resources in rural areas by a group of people, that is with a self-defined and distinct identity, and by more importantly using the communally owned facilities. So therefore, in some way focuses on how a group or a particular community have actually used the resources. Now some of the key assumptions which we can identify from the community-based natural resource management are that locals or people who are close to those natural surroundings are better placed or in a better positions to conserve natural resources, and secondly people will in some way conserve a resource only if they actually get the benefits and exceed the cost of conservation. And people will also engage in conserving the resources that is linked directly to the quality of life. So when local people's quality of life is in some sense enhanced, their efforts and commitment to ensure the future well-being of the resource are also enhanced. Now how do the locals in some way co-manage or engage in this co-management of the resources? There are institutional arrangement such as the local bodies, and then which of course consist of the more importantly the local stakeholders. So institutional arrangement for natural resource management in which the decision making authority is actually being shared between the local people and regional or national government. So this could be seen from the works of Pinkerton. Some of the proposed benefits which we can sort of derive from the community-based natural resource management are that it would sort of increase social legitimacy and likelihood of implementation of management decisions, and secondly the applications of diverse knowledge sources to management, local knowledge and science. So it also in some way improve on the ground resource management, and it also increase monitoring and adaptive management and decrease conflict over resources. And also there is a possibility of increased trust and strengthened relationship within the communities, and it will also improve the livelihoods of people who are dependent on those resources, and a greater community capacity and improve environment conditions and more resilient social ecological systems. So what we have discussed so far in this lecture is to sort of identify what natural resources is and what natural resource management is, and then what are the, why is it necessary for us to conserve natural resources. So the basic necessity and the importance or significance of conserving resources are something which we have discussed so far, and also familiarize ourselves with what community-based resources are, and then what community-based natural resource management is. So in the upcoming classes, we're going to discuss some of the debate which revolved around, or the kind of premises within the theme called common and property resources and rights to resources. So those are some of the things which will be discussed in the upcoming lectures. Thank you.